Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and the video I posted yesterday, which I will link down below, discussing a new study that was just released this month that showed that powerlifting training appears to induce as much hypertrophy as bodybuilding style training does. And like I said, that was not a conclusive study by any means, but it is an interesting study nonetheless. And I wouldn't try to draw extreme far-reaching conclusions from it, but it is certainly a worthwhile study that was worth looking into. Now, that being said, I got a lot of questions from people discussing, what about time under tension? What about time under tension? Isn't that the most important aspect of hypertrophy? And again, hypertrophy is gaining muscle. And no, the whole time under tension thing has been really misconstrued by the industry, and it's been turned into a giant pile of bullshit bro science. What time under tension means is that we know the more time that a muscle spends under load doing the same amount of work, that up to a certain threshold at least, there's obviously very diminished returns, the more hypertrophy it tends to induce. That someone who comes in and does several sets, particularly if they're doing multiple reps, tends to gain more muscle over time than someone who's coming in and, say, hitting a 1 rep max on their squat, bench, deadlift and going home with minimal amounts of ramping sets. So there's very, very little fatigue work, and they're just hitting a max, which is training. Obviously muscles are getting trained heavily, but the nervous system is getting trained quite a bit more. And they aren't really inducing any metabolic fatigue. It's pure mechanical tension of very, very low volumes. Doesn't produce massive amounts of hypertrophy, at least by comparison. But it will make you bigger. A person could gain a substantial amount of size doing that over time, but it's not going to be anywhere near as efficient or as fast as you might want. But what people have done with this is they've tried to come up with really bizarre concepts, like you need ultra high reps, or you need slow concentric reps or slow eccentric reps to induce more time under tension, based upon this fact that we know that more volume can induce more hypertrophy. Here's the problem with that. The data has never supported this. That has always been hypothetical type stuff, and when studied, it doesn't always pan out in the real world. And what I mean is, people will try to say, well, if you do slow negatives, it's more time under tension, it's more micro tearing of the muscles, and they grow faster. Well, when we study it, they don't. That was something that people came up with in the 80s and 90s, and then when it was studied, we found that people who do 1 second controlled eccentric reps gained muscle using the same weight over time as people who did the 4 second slow ones. It made no measurable difference to do the slower negatives in muscle size. It did create a little more soreness and a little more DOM, so that you got more sore, but there was no benefit in terms of gains. And in fact, there's newer data that's come out in the last year that's even suggesting that in some cases, even faster negatives, so lowering the weight even faster to get a better stretch reflex, in some cases seems to induce a little more hypertrophy. Now, that research is still in the preliminary work, and there's a long way to go before any conclusions can be drawn. But it's showing quite the opposite. In that case, reducing time under tension dramatically seems to give a small edge. Well, same when we go to concentric reps. People say, well, if you do it slower, you're recruiting more muscle fibers because it's more time under tension. But that's not true. We know that if you take the same weight and you move it for the same number of reps, even if it's 1 rep, the faster that you accelerate it, the more muscle fibers are recruited. And it makes sense from a basic physics perspective. To get a weight moving very, very quickly requires more energy to do so. Whereas in moving it slower, simply put, requires less force generation. And you don't get any further benefits from it than if you would just use a lighter weight at a faster tempo. So you actually end up reducing the amount of muscle fibers you gain per rep with the same amount of weight when you do that. So again, time under tension is not beneficial in that case. Where time under tension becomes beneficial is if, let's say, you bench press 100 kilos for 5 reps normally, but you're able to increase it to 6 reps or 7 reps or 8 reps. You've increased time under tension with the same tempo, the same workload. You've done more work with the muscle. It'll induce more metabolic fatigue from those higher reps that are going up at the same weight. You'll gain muscle from it. That is what time under tension should mean, and it's been bastardized into this nonsense that doesn't have any meaning. So people need to lose this whole idea of the time under tension, the way they're thinking of it, because it's never panned out in the real world. The amount of time under tension that you need to induce really good hypertrophy is much, much lower than people think. Meaning all the early programs we saw for athletes like football players, like the Bill Starr stuff, where you ramped up to a single maximum 5 rep set, The extra warm-up sets with relatively heavy weight, getting up towards 60-70% of your max, and then finishing off with around 85%, combined together with only one heavy set, seem to be enough to get guys to grow really, really fast when these programs are designed for football players. A lot of people would say, well, that's low time under tension, but it's not. It's enough. And it's certainly a lot more than coming in and doing 2 or 3 one-rep training maxes, which won't induce large amounts of hypertrophy for most people. So therein lies the difference. People are taking something of understanding that just doing low volumes, very, very low volumes of one-rep maxes doesn't induce as much hypertrophy due to potential metabolic fatigue and time under tension to coming in and doing a 5-rep set or a 5-rep set with a back-off set. And that's what it was originally intended to mean, and people have just run with it off into left field and made it into something it was never intended to be, and it's turned into, as I've said, a giant pile of bullshit bro science now. And a lot of gurus and experts spout it. And it creates a big convoluted mess. So honestly, most of you can really forget the term and not even worry about it. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it has been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time. But let me give you guys a bicep shot before I go. And since I'm standing up, I'll give you guys a side chest also.